sharing the PowerPoint. So hopefully y'all can see this. And I'm gonna just change it to so just me's there in the way. So one of the things that's happened over the last few months, along with being quarantined and the coronavirus, has been a lot of unrest, particularly after the death of George Floyd, and his was just a death in a long line of, unfortunately, mostly African American, mostly men, but a few women as well, who were killed, who were unarmed by police. But as that has come up, part of that has also been that there's been a call to take down Confederate monuments, and actually most of the ones in Richmond have been taken down, or at least quite a few of most of them. The one you see here, Robert E. Lee, has not. And as I was thinking about that, I was looking for something else, and I came across it. I actually started this in 2017, and we had this conversation in 2017. I just didn't finish the PowerPoint and some of the research I wanted to do. Let me let some folks in. Still waiting on Pia to join. Anyway, so saying all that is in 2017, after Dylan Roof killed, I think it was 9 people in an African-American church, specifically because of racist ideas. There was a lot of talk of taking down Confederate monuments then, partly because he had, before he committed that mass murder, he had posted a lot of things with Confederate images. And people began to realize that, yeah, maybe there is a tie between a lot of these Confederate images and a lot of racism, particularly white supremacy. And of course, there's a lot of white Southerners. They're mostly white Southerners. I won't say there may be a few African American, Black people in the South or in the country who don't think that Confederate monuments or flags have to do with white supremacy in their origin, but the majority of people see a tie in it at some point. So I wanted to look at that more because that has been, now that Richmond is actively taking down monuments, trying to decide what to do with them. There's lawsuits to put those that have been taken down back up, and lawsuits to prevent those that are up from being taken down, and they're still in the courts. That's not been decided. But it would be good to go back and look at what did the people of that time say. As my church history professor would say, go back to those primary sources. In other words, look at what was happening when they were put up and look at what they stand for. So that's what I want to start today. I realized it's going to take 2 weeks, at least 2 weeks to do this, depending on how many questions we have at the end and what that brings up. But I want to start by just giving an overview of the kind of major statues, at least in Richmond. I don't have every single one, but the major and most of the biggest part of them and the most famous ones are here along Monument Avenue here in Richmond. One of the probably the most famous street in Richmond, and it's often been voted as one of the more beautiful and important streets, at least in the South, if not the country. So these are mostly in order, and I should have written down the dates that they were put up, but we'll look at that next week. The first and the largest of all the monuments is that of Robert E. Lee. And so, sorry, and as I hear things, I'm going to have to admit people. So I'm going to give just a brief description of some of these people and some interesting facts about either them and or the monuments. Robert E. Lee was a top graduate of the United States Military Academy. He was an exceptional officer in the United States Army for 32 years. He served as the superintendent of the United States Military Academy at West Point. When the war broke out, or when Virginia chose to secede and war was inevitable, Lee chose to follow his home state of Virginia, despite his desire for the country to remain intact. And he was actually offered a senior command within the Union Army. Many Virginians will tell you that they're quite proud of the fact that Robert E. Lee is probably the only person who was offered a senior command in opposing armies. I've never researched to see if that's true of anybody else, but it is true of him. He commanded the Army of Northern Virginia from 1862 until its surrender in 1865, and he earned a reputation as a very skilled tactician. After the war, Lee became president of Washington College, which is now known as Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. In that position, he supported reconciliation between the North and South. Lee accepted the extinction of slavery provided for by the 13th Amendment, but he opposed racial equality for African Americans that was built into the 14th Amendment, which is where African American men, at least, were allowed to vote. And ladies, we'll have to have another session sometime about how long it was before women got equality in the vote. Robert E. Lee has also chose, each state was allowed to have 2 statues in a statue hall in the U.S. Capitol in Washington. And Virginia chose George Washington and Robert E. Lee. I did see that recently there was a panel in Virginia that was put together to look at that, and they have unanimously voted that we should replace the Robert E. Lee statue. I don't think that I've heard who they want to replace it with. So other statues along there. One of the other ones, and this was the first one on Monument Avenue to come down by the city. It was not the very first one to come down because Jefferson Davis was torn down by protesters. J.E.B. Stuart, who everybody just called Jeb. So Jeb Stuart was a United States Army officer from Virginia. He became a Confederate States Army general during the American Civil War. He was a cavalry commander known for his mastery of reconnaissance and the use of cavalry in the support of offensive operations. And he was mortally wounded at the Battle of Yellow Tavern in 1864. Most of the information I'm getting from these, just general information, came from either Wikipedia or a few other sites. And I should have put those down, but I think this was from Wikipedia, as was the information about Robert E. Lee. This is also from Wikipedia. Jefferson Davis served as president of the Confederate States from 1861 to 1865. He was a member of the Democratic Party, and he represented Mississippi in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives before the American Civil War. He previously served as United States Secretary of War from 1853 to 1857 under President Franklin Pierce. He was born in Kentucky, and he grew up in Mississippi. Of all of the monuments on Monument Avenue, including Arthur Ashe, which we're not going to talk about because he's obviously not a Civil War person, but Jefferson Davis is the only monument on Monument Avenue who is not from Virginia. Stonewall Jackson. Thomas Stonewall Jackson served as Confederate general during the American Civil War and became one of the best-known Confederate commanders after General Robert E. Lee. Jackson played a prominent role in nearly all military engagements in the Eastern Theater of War until his death, and he had a key part in winning many significant battles. And he was known, the name Stonewall is because his units would stand like a stone wall to the Union Army when he fought against them. From 1851 to 1861, so right before the war, he taught at the Virginia Military Institute, where he was unpopular with his students due to his difficulty relating to students and a lack of sense of humor. I first read that on Wikipedia, and I was not going to put this in here unless I could confirm that. And there was a link to VMI's webpage, and VMI actually has information about him. And apparently he was not a very pleasant person to be around. He was always very serious. His classes were incredibly hard because apparently he was a brilliant military tactician and military engineer, but he was not very good at teaching that information to others. So there's a lot of people who are very intelligent, very good at what they do, but don't do a good job of teaching it. And apparently he was one of those, to the point where his students had names for him and would try to play pranks on him, which he did not like. Matthew Fontaine Maury was an American astronomer, naval officer, historian, oceanographer, meteorologist, cartographer, author, geologist, and educator. He was nicknamed the Pathfinder of the Seas and father of modern oceanography and naval meteorology, and later scientist of the seas, for his extensive works in his books, especially The Physical Geography of the Sea, the first such extensive and comprehensive book on oceanography to be published. Maury made many important contributions to charting winds and ocean currents, including ocean lanes for passing ships at sea. He became superintendent of the United States Naval Observatory and head of the depot of charts and instruments. He published the Wind and Current Chart of North Atlantic, which showed sailors how to use the ocean's currents and winds to their advantage, drastically reducing the length of ocean voyages. He was made commander of the Confederate States Navy and appointed as chief of the Naval Bureau of Coast, Harbor, and River Defense. Maury helped develop the first electronically controlled naval mine, which caused havoc for Union shipping during the war. He later, after the war, taught physics at VMI and advocated for an agricultural college that later became Virginia Tech. In my personal opinion, Maury is one who you could make a case that there should be a monument or statue of him somewhere, but the reason he's on Monument Avenue is because he was commander of the Confederate States Navy. He did have pretty racist views, and even after the war at time looked at beginning having Confederates move to first Mexico and then somewhere in South America, neither of which ever came to be. But I'm not sure that Monument Avenue is the best place for him. Somewhere by a naval research place or something like that would be a more appropriate place for him. One of the more interesting and difficult to move statues is that of A.P. Hill. It's also probably the first statue that should have come down long ago, and actually all of these, we'll make that case later. This one should have come down for a reason other than because it's a Confederate. A.P. Hill is a native Virginian. He was a career United States Army officer who fought in the Mexican-American War and Seminole Wars prior to joining the Confederacy. He was promoted to lieutenant general and commanded the 3rd Corps of Robert E. Lee's Army of the Northern Virginia, which he led in the Gettysburg Campaign in the fall campaigns of 1863. So, and I've got some more to talk about him. The reason I say that this probably should have come down before, or actually been moved, and the city actually tried to move it back in the 60s because it makes the intersection where it is, at the intersection, it's right in the middle of the intersection of Hermitage Road and Laburnum Road. And as those roads widened and got bigger, the statue made that intersection just much, much more dangerous. And it's still a very dangerous intersection. There's a lot of accidents there because it's kind of hard to navigate around it. It's not big enough to be a true traffic circle, but it's kind of a circle and people are not quite sure what to do, and that leads to accidents. So that is one of the reasons it probably should be moved one way or another, even if it's just to the side of the road. But on the other side of that, it's a problem taking it down because not only is it a statue of him, he is actually buried in the base of it. He was shot near Petersburg on April 2nd, 1865, as his battle lines were collapsing during the last days of the war. He had worked with Pickett, so the Pickett Society has done some research on him. And they found that after he first died, wanting to get him buried quickly and away from Union lines, that he was buried south of the James River near Bossier Dam in what is now the city of Richmond, but at the time would have been Chesterfield County. I'm very curious about that because that's not far from where I live, and I didn't know that. So now I want to see if I can find where that was. He was in that grave for 2 years, or his body was, before he was unearthed, and he was then transferred to Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, which is where some of his former soldiers would have preferred him to be. And then in 1891, the remains were moved again and buried actually under the statue erected in his honor at the intersection of Laburnum Avenue and Hermitage Road. And per his last will and testament, he is interred standing up in that monument. So it does make for interesting complications in trying to move it and where it should be moved, and what to do. You know, does his body just go with it in the base, or do they have another grave? And so other people will have to decide that. And hopefully this is still working. I just got a signal that my internet connection is unstable. Hold on just a second. Let me do something. All right, let me see if my internet switched over. So wanting to see if everybody is still there. Is everybody still there with us? I'm going to unmute y'all for my, just want to make sure I hear you. So, okay, let me get back to this. So, sorry, I had some internet problems, so I just put a line in it, so hopefully that will work. So, going back to the statues, and then the last one I'm just going to talk about is the monument to all Confederate soldiers and sailors. It's on Libby Hill. It was completed in 1894. It has probably one of the best views of the city of Richmond and the James River, and it looked over what would have been the Confederate Navy Yards at the time. There are a handful of other statues that have been taken down. I think there were a couple in Monroe Park. I know one was to Wickham. One was to a different Lee besides Robert E. Lee, who had been governor of Virginia. And then there were two that were to individual units that had fought in the Civil War. One of them had also fought, I think, in the Revolutionary War. They were in the fan area in some of those small triangle parks, but those also have been removed. So the question is, why were these monuments here to start with? So looking it up, the Oxford English Dictionary says monuments are a statue, building, or other structure erected to commemorate a famous or notable person or event. One of the arguments about taking them down is you're erasing history. I find that not to be a great argument in and of itself, because monuments in themselves are not teaching history. They're there to honor and basically kind of glorifies might be a big word, but they're there to honor someone. And as I have read through a lot of things that were said at that time, it's almost like these people had become saints. All those who had fought in the Civil War were like saints. And that's the one thing they all have in common. These are all monuments to men who fought for the South in the Civil War. So to kind of really deal with what does that mean, as far as people saying that it has to do with racism, I think before we even look at what people were saying when these monuments were put up, because these monuments were put up between the 1890s and the 1920s mostly. There were very few monuments before the early 1890s. The majority of them probably went up in the early 1900s. So that gets to the question of, why was the war fought? There are those, mostly those of us from the South, who had textbooks from in the 60s, and I realized when I saw a reprint of one of these online or in the newspaper, it was probably the textbook I had when I was in 4th grade, that said that the Civil War was not about slavery, and that slavery was a benign institution. That, in other words, it was a good institution, that people, slaves were not mistreated and they were happy. We'll talk more about that next week. What I wanted to do is to look at what were the people in 1860 and just before saying about the Civil War. And part of that is it helps to understand some of what kind of the precipitating events were. The first was the election of 1860. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, who was the first Republican president, was elected president. At that time, the Republican platform was created not solely on, but strongly on a abolition standpoint, abolition platform. In other words, many people within the party called for the end of slavery everywhere. Slavery by that time was not allowed. Almost pretty much all the states north of Virginia, and a line kind of going through the country, had outlawed slavery. Most of the states below, from Virginia and down, still had slaves in varying degrees. And so that was a big divide between the North and the South. And the Republican Party had very clearly said they wanted to get rid of slavery. Lincoln himself said that he wanted to see the end of slavery, but he did not run as president saying that he would end slavery. And that's one of the things that comes up in some of the speeches and letters that you will see in a few minutes. So there were some states that as soon as Lincoln was elected, and some southern states, as soon as he was elected, chose to secede. In other words, they left the United States of America. They left the Union. For others, it was after the Battle of Fort Sumter, which is by most historians count the first battle of the Civil War. It was a naval battle. There were no actual casualties in it, but Fort Sumter sat in Charleston Harbor. It was a Union base, as all Army bases were at the beginning of the war, or just before the war started. The South Carolina militia said that they were ready to take it, and the Union said, no, the Union officers there said, no, we're going to stay. So the South bombarded it. The Union Army that was there was vastly outnumbered, and the South had, kept them from being able to resupply the fort, and so they surrendered the fort after a lot of bombardment, but my understanding was no casualties. So this, just to kind of give you an idea of the United States in 1860, and I'm going to have, I hope you all don't mind some of this. I found a lot of this very fascinating, and it was easy to kind of chase rabbits and forget what kind of the point of this was. But some things that hopefully visually will help. So all of the states in kind of pink, light red, and red are the states that seceded from the Union, and all of them were slave states. The blue states are all the states that slavery was illegal. Slavery was banned in all the blue states, and they were part of the Union. The yellow states are the four states that did have slavery, but chose to stay in the Union. And we could add, if you notice that Virginia has kind of a strange outline, and that's because up until 1862, what is now West Virginia was part of Virginia. And when Virginia chose to secede, West Virginia, which most of the counties that make up West Virginia now had very, very few slaves and wanted to stay in the Union, used this as an opportunity to split from Virginia and form their own state that is now known as West Virginia. The little bit again, that was one of the rabbits I started chasing, realized it was not the main point here. But my understanding was that those counties really actually wanted to form their own state long before the Civil War. And the Civil War just finally gave them the ability to do that because the Constitution did not allow for states to separate, to split, unless the state government allowed it. And of course, Richmond wasn't going to allow a bunch of counties to leave. But once Virginia left the Union, it was no longer under the Constitution. And so West Virginia formed what at the time was Virginia, and they became the Virginia representatives in the United States Congress. Which I found kind of interesting. I didn't realize that part of it. And the difference in colors is the red states, the dark red states had all seceded or left the Union before Fort Sumter, before April 15th, 1861. And the pink ones, or the light red ones, they left after the Battle of Fort Sumter, when they saw that the Union was serious at actually going to war over the state seceding. It also helps to know um, how slavery kind of fit in. So one of the things somehow I had missed is I knew that the percentage of slaves in Virginia was lower than it was in probably the deeper South. What I didn't realize is because Virginia was the most populous southern state, it was the fifth most populous state in the Union at the time. In other words, had the fifth biggest population in the Union, but it was the largest population in the South, which meant that even having what it says here is 30%, there were 490,000, over 490,000 slaves in Virginia in 1860. And this is from the census of 1860. One of the things I just didn't have time to either figure out myself or research is that 30%, in other words, 30% of the population was Black slaves. I'm pretty sure that because that was 1860, that what became West Virginia was included in that. I would be curious to see what that percentage would be, or what that percentage is of what is now modern day Virginia. And it would be higher. I don't know how significantly higher, but it would be higher. But this gives you an idea of the number of slaves and the percentage of the population of slaves of other states. One of the issues for the South in the Civil War, and one of the reasons that when we get talking about whether Virginia would secede, was that the North was had a significantly larger population, which meant they could put together a much larger army. It was much more industrialized, so they could put out more weapons and supplies and all those things than the South could. And you see this, that Virginia, had a 1,597,000, almost 1,597,000 total residents. 1,105,000 were free, and almost 491,000 were slaves. And that was about 30%. In Georgia, you can see the numbers here where they were about 43% of the population was slave. And you see, as we get others, they get even closer. Alabama at 45%. What's fascinating is Mississippi and South Carolina both had more than half of their population were enslaved. So you can also imagine that those two states, that the whites in those states would be very nervous about all of a sudden freeing all the slaves because the whites were outnumbered, pretty significantly outnumbered in those two states. One of the things that surprised me was that the population of Florida was actually pretty small back then. But I started thinking about it. It's like, can you imagine living through a Florida summer without air conditioning? So that may explain part of it. And then the states that stayed in the Union that were slave states, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and then the other was Delaware, all had much lower percentages of slaves. There were significant numbers, but as far as a percentage of their population, it was pretty low, and Delaware's was even lower. One of the things I don't think I ever really thought about until I listened to a book on Abraham Lincoln and his cabinet was the worth of the slaves, and that will come up in some of the reasoning for secession, that the South, particularly Southern planters, who were the very wealthy of their day, had a lot of their wealth tied up into slaves. They saw slaves as property. They paid a lot of money for that property. And of course, they don't want to give up that property without a fight, which is kind of what happens. So it was estimated, and this comes from one of a letter from a governor of Georgia. It was estimated in 1860 that the value of all the slaves in the South was $2.25 billion in 1860 dollars, which would be approximately, I just went to a calculator on inflation that said that would be the equivalent of $69.8 billion today. So that's a lot of money. It's no small amount of money. And so one of the questions is how, one of the things bandied about before the war of trying to see if the Union could be preserved was there a way to free the slaves and reimburse the slave owners for those slaves? Obviously, one, the South wasn't ready to do that, the North couldn't afford it, and the war settled that. I found this kind of interesting, being that there were a lot more slaves than I realized in Virginia. Found this map, which is based off of from 1860 or just after, from the census of 1860. And the darker gray means that there were more slaves. And there are a couple of counties I wrote down. Let me find my notes here. It was interesting, in Chesterfield County, 45%, Chesterfield where I live, just south of the river, 45% of the population was slave. In Henrico, it was less, it was 34%. But there were counties like Nottoway and Amelia where it was 74%, 72% in Amelia. Hanover County was over 50% at 55%. Newkent was 62%. Prince George, 63%. So there's a lot of places here, particularly in central Virginia, where the population there were more slaves than free whites, or free people. The vast majority would have been white. There would have been a few free, black former slaves. But also, as you see, the further west you get, the lighter it is. And so there's very few slaves in these western counties, and the counties that become eventually West Virginia are where it's not. So these dots there was a convention held, I think it was in Suffolk, I should have written that down. And the delegates, where they were from, it shows you kind of how much they supported secession. Now, some of those voting against secession didn't mean that they wanted to get rid of slavery. It just meant that they recognized that some of them probably were against slavery, because there were abolitionists in Virginia. But also there were people who were realists to say, this is not going to be a good thing for Virginia. And as we know from history, it was not a good thing for Virginia because much of the war was fought here. But as you see, the majority where things are dark, almost everybody was voting to secede. So a lot of this starts going back to the founding of our country. There were conflicting principles at the founding of our country. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I will tell you that my daughter's favorite line in Hamilton is where Abigail, his sister-in-law, not Abigail, anyway, I'll remember names in a minute, has a line where she says that all men are created equal, and that when she meets Tom Jefferson, that women will be in the sequel. But at that time, it was all men were created equal. Constitution, which was to be for all people, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, and etc., the welfare, secure blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. So when they talk about liberty, they're only talking about the liberty for white, mostly males. But as you see, when you get to Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, how representation would be decided in Congress, the southern states, who don't see their slaves as people, they see them as property, also recognize that if more than half of your population is slaves, they still want to count them to be, to help out with their representation in Congress. So the compromise was that if you were bound for service, there were still, I guess, some indentured servants who, to pay off a debt, would agree to work for somebody for, say, room and board for X number of years. I think it's often 6 or so. And, getting back, there we are. So all the free persons, and this includes just indentured servants who are only bound to service for X number of years, and Indians who were not taxed, all others were counted as 3/5 of a person. In other words, slaves. Slaves were only counted as 3/5 of a person. For those who wonder, why the Black Lives Matter says that, part of that is going back to the beginning. This is kind of an example of Black lives not really mattering. They only mattered 3/5, and that's only because they wanted that representation. Article 4, Section 2 says that no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered upon claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. In other words, if a slave escapes from Virginia, North Carolina, somewhere in the South, and this was the original 13th state, and gets up to where there's no more slavery, like Pennsylvania, the Constitution says that Pennsylvania has to help capture that and return that slave to the slaveholders. And that's important because that becomes a bone of contention for the South, because a lot of the northern states stopped doing that. So they said that basically the northern states were not keeping their end of the constitutional bargain. So hopefully in just the next few minutes here, I want to look at specific things that were being said before secession. So I will say that officially, someone who says that the Civil War was about states' rights is correct. It was about whether states have the right to secede from the Union or not. And that really is why the war was fought. The North did not fight the South, at least initially, to free slaves. They fought the South because the South was seceding, was saying that they were going to pull out of the Union. And the North said, no, we are one country and we're going to stay as one country. And there's a lot of economic reasons for that we could get into, but that in essence was in a nutshell. So what we need to look at is, why did the South want to secede? Now, there's very seldom is there one reason, but it's pretty obvious as you read things from 1860 that the overarching reason is slavery. So this is from, and these are excerpts, these are not the whole letters, or we'd be here all afternoon as I tried to find the places in them. Most of these I've tried to put where I got them from. And if you want the citations, I do have them, at least most of them, saved on my computer. I will also say I got a lot of this from the Library of Virginia. It has a lot of incredible online resources. When it's more possible to go and get into the library, I would love to go in and look at some of these original documents, if that's possible. I may not be a researcher of such standing to do that, but there's a lot of scans of these original documents and transcriptions that people have made it easier to read. So this, though, came from Civil War causes, and this was Governor Joseph Brown's letter to the people of Georgia. So almost all states, before they seceded, had a convention. And so this was a letter from Governor Joseph Brown of Georgia, kind of giving his ideas on whether Georgia should secede or not. And he says that he didn't have a whole lot of time to prepare a reply, because obviously there's a lot of going on after Lincoln was elected, and and states deciding whether they're going to stay in the Union, because that would change a lot of things even within a state. So here are his three propositions. The first, and this was, Lincoln would have been elected in November of 1860. Back then, inaugurations were in March, and so he would not have been inaugurated or become president until March of that year. And Georgia's convention was in December. So first question is the election of Mr. Lincoln sufficient cause to justify Georgia and the other southern states from seceding? And he says that he is the mere representative of a fanatical abolition sentiment, the mere instrument of a great triumphant political party, the principles of which are deadly hostile to the institution of slavery, and openly at war with the fundamental doctrines of the Constitution, those doctrines being the 3/5 and the return of slaves. The rights of the South and the institution of slavery are not endangered by the triumph of Mr. Lincoln, the man, but they are in imminent danger from the triumph of the powerful party which he represents and the fanatical abolition sentiment which brought him into power. So his very first point is the concern about the abolition of slavery, with not just Lincoln becoming president, but more Republicans having seats in Congress. So what will be the results to the institution of slavery, which will follow submission to the inauguration? His opinion is that it will be the total abolition of slavery and the utter ruin of the South in less than 25 years. So again, fear of this is what would happen. Not only does he see that slavery will end, that it will be the ruin of the South. His third point is, what will the effect of the abolition of slavery be on the interests and social positions of non-slaveholders and poor white laborers? And here's where he brings up the amount of wealth that is tied up in slavery. He said it would bring misery and ruin on all of them, particularly the middle and lower class, because who is going to have this property taken from them without paying for it? This is where I got the numbers of 2.5 billion. I multiplied 4.5 million times $500, and you get 2.5 billion. So you see that there were 4.5 million slaves in the southern states. They were worth somewhere around $2.5 billion. And so if they're worth that much, the question is, how are we going to do that? And if the government is going to pay this back, it's going to mean taxing all of those who are not slave owners. So he saw that was going to be bore by the brunt of non-slave holders and poor white laborers. He didn't see any chance that this would happen without these plantation workers getting lots of their, getting their money back for their slaves. Back when Charlottesville happened, and this is where I first started this, looking for primary documents, I realized that when the United States broke away from Great Britain, there was a Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. So I said, was there declarations of secession? And I found at the battlefields.org site, another place that has a lot of really good primary source things from that era, but also on other wars, because their mission is to preserve battlefields. But these are the reasons given by at least 4 of the states for why they want to secede. And again, these are excerpts. Most of them, at some point or another, South Carolina being a good example, and Virginia's, spend some time just on the legal reasons that they can do it. They voluntarily join the Union, so they can voluntarily disjoin the Union. They can pull out of the Union. And that's kind of their legal reasoning, and that makes sense to make that case. And the official documents pulling out of the Union, pretty much that's all they say. But these 3 of the 4 states also had a little bit more information on why they were doing it. So in South Carolina, they said a geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in an election of a man to the high office of president whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. He is to be entrusted with the administration of the common government because he has declared that the government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. And that was a comment from a speech he made during the election season before he was president. And that the public mind must rest in the belief that slavery is in the course of ultimate extinction. So South Carolina here, as one of their first reasons, other than just that they can do it, legally why they can do it, is because of the extinction of slavery. Georgia. For the last 10 years, we've had numerous and serious causes of complaint against our non-slaveholding Confederate states with reference to the subject of African slavery. They have endeavored to weaken our security, disturb our domestic peace and tranquility, and persistently refuse to comply with their express constitutional obligations to us in reference to that property. What they're talking about is when slaves, escape, many on the Underground Railroad, they are getting to other states, and those states are not returning them to their proper owners, as the Constitution requires under the fugitive slave section of the Constitution. And that was a common thing among a lot of the things that I read. Mississippi. Mississippi was the most blatant. This was after a short sentence of introduction. This is at the very beginning of theirs. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions, and by an imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. So what they're saying is that, again, going back to the, all the wealth tied up into it, but also that the cotton in Mississippi would be one of the producers of a lot of cotton, that it is a very productive and lucrative crop. And because where they are growing this, it is a very hot, humid climate, that only the black race can bear the exposure to that tropical sun, that whites can't even get out and do that work. I don't know how much they tried, but that's theirs. And then Texas, which has a pretty long one, and some of these also, there are other reasons of this, but it is obvious that slavery was the kind of the big reason that made them want to do it. There was some issues with tariffs, but honestly, most of the issues had to do around slavery. So Texas in theirs was quite blunt in saying, for years past, this abolition organization has been actively sowing the seeds of discord through the Union, and has rendered the federal Congress the arena for spreading firebrands and hatred between slaveholding and non-slaveholding states. So when you identify yourself as a slaveholding state, that also gives you an idea that that's what this is about. By consolidating their strength, they have placed the slaveholding states in a hopeless minority in the federal Congress and rendered representation of no avail in protecting Southern rights against their extractions and encroachments. So in other words, they're using, one of the things you would hear is, taxation or laws without representation. They did have representation, though. The United States, when they broke away from Great Britain, had absolutely no representation. Before Texas and the other southern states seceded, while they were a minority, so that they often would probably lose votes, they did have a voice and representation in Congress. But Texas goes on to be even more blunt. We hold as undeniable truths that the governments of the various states and the Confederacy itself were established exclusively by the white race for themselves and their posterity, that the African race had no agency in their establishment, that they were rightfully held and regarded as an inferior and dependent race, and in that condition only could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable. That is a basic definition of white supremacy. That in this free government, all white men are and right ought to be entitled to equal civil and political rights, that the servitude of the African race as existing in these states is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator, as recognized by all Christian nations. While the destruction of the existing relations between the two races, as advocated by our sectional enemies, would bring inevitable calamities upon both and desolation upon the 15 slave-holding states. I know it's getting close to 4, so I'll try and go through the rest quickly. One of the things that I started to do, I realized there's just more time. There were, I found at least 2, I know a book and a pamphlet that were put out by pastors and theologians on the biblical basis of slavery. The one that I was first familiar with was by Furman. I want to say Richard Furman, but I may have the first name wrong, who is the namesake of Furman University. He was also the founder of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary that started out in Greenville, South Carolina, before moving to Louisville, Kentucky. And he wrote a book on the biblical basis of slavery. And so this, the will of the Almighty Creator was a very common theme among the Christians of the South, not the North, but of the South. So how about here in Virginia? What were people saying? So this is a speech at the convention whether or not the Virginia should secede. And there was talk, at first Virginia was wanting to stay with the Union and hoping to work out a deal. Obviously the deal was to keep all their slaves. And so there was talk about a peace conference. And this peace conference declares that a slaveholder of the southern states shall not have the right to travel over a non-slaveholding state with his property, while a Yankee from the Green Mountains of Vermont may trot his Morgan horse through the state of Virginia, live here, and claim the protection of the laws of the land of his property. Is that equality? Is that justice? That I should be denied the privilege of taking my property wherever I desire, while the North can take theirs wherever they want? and Virginia will not submit. What he's talking about property is his slaves. A Virginian could easily go to the north and go through Vermont with a horse, but they couldn't take their slaves north, or their slaves would automatically be free. That's what he's saying here. John Baldwin of Stanton is taking the view, and this is an excerpt, that entertain the opinion that African slavery as it exists in Virginia is a right and good thing on every ground, moral, social, religious, political, and economical. A blessing alike to the master and the slave, a blessing to the non-slaveholder and the slaveholder. I entertain these views and opinions now. So I'm not one of those who look forward with expectation or desire to its extinction at any time or in any place. So there were those who said that slavery would have gone away. I don't think it would have. Slavery actually increased up to 1860 before the Civil War. He goes on to say that his views, as opposed to the views of other people, are the views that he takes from the standpoint of a pro-slavery man representing a slaveholding constituency. I, sir, representing a constituency who have in men and in money more resources than any other people in this old dominion, and who hold all their resources at the call of the Commonwealth, to protect and defend this great interest as earnestly and devotedly as any other interest whatsoever. So he's saying that they would use all of their resources, including their slaves, to defend this interest, which is slavery. That's the interest he's talking about. The Library of Virginia has several scans of newspapers, one of which is the Daily Dispatch, which eventually becomes the Richmond Times-Dispatch. It was a daily paper. They mostly had pretty short little articles, lots of advertisements and things like that. And this is one I got lost reading through those because I found it interesting just to see what they were talking about. To remind myself that it was not just slavery that they talked about even in 1860, but it does come up quite often. And this was there, and this was because when the North and South were deciding, one, should the South secede? Two, would Virginia go with the North? Would Virginia stay in the Union, or would Virginia go with the South? There were those in the South who said that Virginia, being such a populous state, really didn't have that many slave owners, and that those who didn't own slaves would be more likely to not fight for the South than they would for the North, or at least sit out the war, if Virginia seceded. And what this says is, it appears from returns in possession of the Auditor of Public Accounts that there are at present time in Virginia 53,456 slave owners over 21 years of age. This is about 1/4 of the entire portion of the population who have arrived at the years of maturity. In other words, adults who would be old enough to own slaves. The statement refutes the often repeated assertion of the Northern journalists that a comparatively small proportion of the inhabitants of Virginia are interested in the institution of slavery, and the irrepressible conflict will find the Old Dominion ready to defend slavery in which she is so materially concerned. So here is the Richmond Dispatch, Daily Dispatch, basically saying, there are a lot of slave owners in Virginia, and they will defend slavery. So for them, they're fighting for slavery. So after Lincoln was elected, many of the localities around the state were putting together their own little, conventions or conferences to say whether or not that there should be a convention to talk about secession in the state of Virginia, and whether or not the state should secede. And the website there lets you crop out parts of the newspaper to look at. And I cropped this out, and I forgot to crop out exactly where this was from. And then when I went back to look for it, they have a lot of papers, and I couldn't remember the exact date. So I can't remember exactly what locality this was, but their resolve. So this is their resolution. The first being that the interest and honor of Virginia require that she should separate from the northern states of America, now controlled by a hostile party whose ultimate object is the overthrow of slavery and oppression of the southern states. It's the first thing they say. And it goes on to say basically that Virginia should, step up and resume the powers granted by the federal government, and that separation from Virginia and the North should be what happens. So that's in brief, and there's a lot more of that, believe me. Why in 1860 people were saying what they were saying were the cause of the Civil War. Like I said, technically you can say it's about states' rights, but it was really, does the state have a right to secede? Because honestly, if the states had the right to secede, the North would have just said, let them go and not say anything. So the North said, no, they don't have the right to secede. Basically, Constitution doesn't say, it doesn't have anything for whether states should secede, but it also doesn't have anything to keep them from seceding. So it was basically the war decided that the states couldn't secede. But the vast majority of the reasons, the biggest reason for the South seceding was over slavery. It was the fear of losing slaves, having slavery abolished. It was northern states not returning slaves, as the Constitution did require. And it also had to do with the expansion of states to the west, because after the Missouri Compromise, any states that came into the Union had to be free states. And Southerners wanted to be able to expand and take their slaves with them. And we'll talk about that a little bit more next week. So next week, we will look some at the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who really sponsored and pushed politically to have many of the monuments that you see both in our state and others put up. But we'll also talk about the Lost Cause, Jim Crow laws, and Confederate statues, and how all those kind of go together. This is a picture. I didn't get a date on it, of members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy under the statue of Jefferson Davis here in Richmond, as you see him holding his flag. So that in a nutshell is the first part of this on the statues, in that, yeah, the Civil War was mostly about slavery. Because one of the arguments I often hear about the statues is the Civil War wasn't really about slavery, it was about other things. No, it was about slavery. When people talk about, it's about heritage, you could say that. It's just, you got to recognize that heritage is slavery. So any questions on this section? Hey, Les. What'd you say, Judy? So any other questions or comments or different opinions?
That was a good job. One thing that I think is interesting, we haven't really gotten into the battles, but when Lee, in the Battle of Manassas, Lee wanted to continue the Battle of Manassas and decide the whole war right then. But Jefferson Davis held him back. So I attribute the North winning the war between the states to Jefferson Davis holding Lee back from taking over the Capitol and everything else. Lee was going to go for everything right there at the first, Battle of Manassas.
Right, and that's, as I started reading this, it was very tempting, because I do find the Civil War quite fascinating. I grew up, my dad had been a history minor in college, and always loved history, and he would take us to a lot of the battlefields around Richmond to visit. So I still find it very fascinating. But I realized that the point of this is getting to the statues, and so I tried to limit myself from following up on just looking at some of those battles. But you're right. In the book on Lincoln, Lincoln was quite concerned about that, because at that point, Washington did not have very good defenses. The states were, a lot of northern states were not taking this seriously, and it was the Battle of Manassas that they said, oh, this is actually a real war. And so that was, I think you're right. I think that had Lee been able to go ahead and take Washington then, which was probably one of the few chances he would have had of doing it, it would have, I don't know if it would have ended the war right there, but it definitely would have changed it drastically. Again, the North did have vastly more resources than the South, so I don't know how that would have worked. I also know that, you know, our country began under Articles of Confederation, and that was a total failure, which is why we had the Constitutional Convention and we now have a constitution. So it would have been curious what would have happened had the South won or the North not gone to war. Eventually, probably some of the states would have tried to rejoin the Union. Some of them would have broken into smaller countries, or, you know, you never know. When you start speculating, there's any number of possibilities what happened.
But we can thank God that the North won.
Yeah, it would be a very different place if they hadn't.
Yeah.
But it, like you said, for me, this helped to start the journey to say, when people say the war wasn't about slavery, like I said, you can technically say, because it really was. I mean, if states had the right to secede, the North just wouldn't let them go. But the reason the South seceded was slavery. Overall, they had a few other things but they were not reasons to secede. The whole reason for seceding was about issues of slavery and the fear of the abolition of slavery, and the expansion to other parts of the country and being able to take your slaves with them.
Thank you. Good job.
Well, thank you. And
Good job.
thank you. Next week, I do want to look a little bit more at some of the actual statues. There's some, you know, I found just interesting pictures, like Robert E. You know, when I see Robert E. Lee now in the fan, surrounded by all these big homes and, you know, suburbs going out for miles and miles from there. When that statue was built, it was a tobacco field. There was nothing there.
Oh.
So, you know, that's another side part of this, of, you know, that, you know, I will tell you that we won't find much in the speeches dedicating these about them being there for white supremacy. But as we look at the stance of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who helped push to have a lot of these put up, as well as other things happening then, it's not too hard to make the tie to that. So we'll do that next week. So I've looked at some of that. I just have to gather it more together. But I will, I did record this and we'll make it available. And I'll try to somehow add, when I do that, some of the websites that I've used, particularly the Library of Virginia has lots of resources. Battlefields.org has lots of resources, and there were some others that I used to get to those primary resources, to say, what were the people then saying? Because I think that's what's important for us to look at. Well, thank y'all. I appreciate everybody hanging in there and being with us, and even less listening in a little bit, I hope.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks. And I'll see y'all later. And hopefully some of y'all will join in when I post the worship service for Sunday. Maybe we can do this on a Sunday sometime as well. So
Yeah.
hope everybody
I
has a
hope
good
I
day.
see you Sunday.
I hope so. I don't know yet, but I hope so. So
Okay.
y'all hang in there, and we'll see you later.
All right.
Everybody.